No 10 is about to fall? Or is she? Eala steps onto center court in Cincinnati carrying more than a racket. She's carrying an entire nation's heartbeat. Across the ocean, in a country where fewer than 2,000 Filipinos live in this part of Ohio, something impossible has happened. 11,000 seats, filled, roaring her name. Tonight, the 21-year-old from Quezon City faces Amanda Anisimova, a former world number 3 who has stood on the best stages tennis has to offer. One of them walks away with a signature win. The other walks away asking hard questions. This is the story of how we got here, and why nobody in that stadium can look away.
To understand what's about to happen in Mason, Ohio, you have to rewind the tape a little further than tonight's scoreboard. You have to go back to a teenager from the Philippines who, not so long ago, was a name only die-hard tennis fans could pronounce correctly. Alexandra Eala, left-handed, 5'9", raised in a country that had never, not once, produced a Grand Slam singles champion, and rarely produced a top 100 WTA player at all. And yet here she is, 21 years old, ranked inside the world's top 20, sitting on one of the most jaw-dropping stat lines in recent WTA history. 9 wins against top 10 opponents, 7 of them collected in this very season alone. Think about that for a second. 7 times in 12 months, Eala has walked onto a court as the underdog against the best players alive, and 7 times she has walked off as the one holding her arms up. Her list of victims reads like a murderer's row of women's tennis. Iga Swiatek, dismantled in Miami. Madison Keys, beaten in the same run. Naomi Osaka and Zhang Qinwen, both fallen during her breakthrough title run in Washington. Jasmine Paolini, Alina Svitolina, twice. Elena Rybakina, Coco Gauff, Jessica Pegula. Every one of those names carries a Grand Slam pedigree. Every one of those names, at some point, left the court having lost to a girl who grew up far from the sport's traditional power centers. But numbers alone don't explain what's happening in Cincinnati this week, because this isn't just a tennis story anymore, it's a cultural phenomenon. Eala has become, by wide consensus, one of the most talked about and most watched players on the entire tour, her matches pulling crowds that seem to defy geography and logic. In a region of the United States where the local Filipino population numbers only in the low thousands, tickets for her matches have become nearly impossible to find. Stadiums seating well over 10,000 people have filled to capacity, wave after wave of flags, chants, and handmade signs, turning what should be a modest third-round match into something closer to a home game. How does a tennis player who doesn't even hail from the host country manage to command a crowd like that? Part of it is timing. Eala arrives in Cincinnati fresh off a title in Washington, where she beat 2 former world number 1s inside a single week, and a run to the 4th round in Toronto that pushed her ranking to a career high inside the top 20. Part of it is simply that fans everywhere, not just in Manila, not just in the Filipino diaspora, have fallen for a player who competes with a fearlessness that seems to grow with the size of the name across the net. And now, across that net tonight, stands a very different kind of story. Amanda Anisimova, 24 years old, a former world number 3, a player who reached the finals of both Wimbledon and the US Open last year, chasing not an underdog's redemption, but a resurrection of her own. Her 2026 season has not gone the way anyone predicted after that stunning 2025. She's clinging to a top 10 ranking that looks more fragile by the week, having won only a fraction of her matches against fellow top 20 competitors this year. 2 players, 2 completely different trajectories. One rising with a nation's help strapped to her back, the other trying to remember what it felt like to be unbeatable. Neither of them has ever faced the other before tonight. There is no history here, no grudge, no bad blood, just 2 careers about to collide for the very first time, in front of a crowd that has already decided, loudly, whose side they're on. That imbalance, the sheer scale of support on one side of the net, is where tonight's tension truly begins.
Every great sports story needs a spark, a single detail that turns a routine matchup into a moment people can't stop discussing. In Cincinnati, that spark isn't a scandal or a slur or a controversial call. It's something rarer and in some ways more uncomfortable for the player on the wrong side of it, an entire arena that no longer feels neutral. Amanda Anisimova said it herself before the match, with a kind of resigned honesty that tennis players rarely offer reporters. Asked about facing Eala for the first time, she didn't pretend the crowd wouldn't matter. She admitted she expected a stadium that would feel, in her words, packed, and that she understood exactly why.
She has been on tour long enough to know what an Eala match has become. She's watched the highlight reels. She's seen the flags. She knew walking in that she would essentially be playing an away game on American soil, in her own country, against a Filipina from the other side of the world. That's the trigger. Not a rivalry born of bad blood, but a rivalry born of pure spectacle. A home nation's own tennis star, a former Grand Slam finalist, reduced to the role of visiting opponent inside her own country's biggest tournament outside the majors. Imagine being a 24-year-old American, once ranked number 3 in the entire world, and having to walk out onto a court in Ohio knowing the crowd's loyalty already belongs to someone else. This is where the tension really starts to build, because it forces a question that fans and pundits have been whispering about for weeks. Is Alex Eala's popularity now so large that it's reshaping the competitive landscape itself? When a crowd's energy becomes this lopsided, does it change how a match is actually played? Does it rattle a former finalist who's used to being the star attraction, not the outsider? There's also the matter of form, and this is where the first real crack of doubt enters Anisimova's side of the story. Her 2025 season was, by any measure, spectacular. 2 Grand Slam finals, multiple WTA 1000 titles. A player who looked for a stretch like the heir apparent to the very top of the sport. But 2026 has told a very different tale. She has struggled to find consistency, losing far more often than winning against players ranked inside the top 20. She is, by her own account, still hungry, still chasing the version of herself that dominated a year ago. But hunger and form are 2 very different things, and tonight, in front of a crowd that isn't hers, the gap between them is about to be tested in the most public way possible. Rick Matchy, the legendary coach who has guided 5 different players to the world #1 ranking, put words to exactly what's at stake here. He called this matchup a great learning test, not for Eala, but specifically framed around what it would reveal about her ceiling. His point cuts both ways, though. If this is a test for Eala against a proven power player, it is equally a test for Anisimova against a rising force that has already dismantled 9 top 10 opponents this year alone. Neither player can afford to treat this as routine. So here is the conflict, laid bare before a single ball is struck under the Cincinnati lights. A heavily favored crowd, a hungry but shaky former finalist, and a teenager turned phenomenon who has made a habit of thriving in exactly these moments. Something has to give. And when the players finally walk out to applause that sounds less like a third-round match and more like a title final, everyone in that stadium knows it too.
By the time the players are announced, the story has already escaped the tennis world and spilled into something much bigger. Social media timelines fill with the same disbelief, repeated in a dozen languages. How is this happening? How does a WTA 1000 event in the American Midwest end up feeling like a home Grand Slam for a player from Southeast Asia? The numbers driving the conversation are almost impossible to ignore. Filipino communities in the greater Cincinnati and Mason, Ohio area are small, a few thousand people at most, scattered across the region. Yet ticket resale sites report the third-round sessions selling at prices normally reserved for semifinals and finals. Local news outlets, initially covering the tournament as a routine sporting event, pivot their coverage entirely toward the phenomenon of the crowd itself. Reporters who came to write about a tennis match find themselves instead writing about a cultural moment. Flags draped over railings, chants echoing between changeovers, entire sections of the arena that seem to have organized themselves around a single shared purpose. Fans who can't get tickets flood watch parties instead, restaurants, bars, community centers across the diaspora lighting up screens for a third-round match that, on paper, is just one of 32 happening across the tournament that week. But this one doesn't feel like just another match, and everyone involved knows it. Online, the reaction splits into 2 distinct currents. On one side, admiration, pure astonishment at what Eala has built in such a short time, discussion of how few athletes in any sport manage to generate this kind of grassroots, borderless following before they've even won a major title. Comparisons start flying to the early days of other athletes who transcended their sport's usual audience, players whose fan bases seemed to outgrow their ranking before the results fully caught up. On the other side, a quieter but persistent thread of sympathy for Anisimova, fans pointing out how difficult it must be to walk into a match like this in your own country and feel like the away player. Some point to her season-long struggles and wonder aloud whether an atmosphere this lopsided could compound the pressure she's already carrying. Tennis commentators, live on air, openly debate whether crowd dynamics like this represent something entirely new for the sport, a shift where popularity, not just ranking, starts to shape the emotional texture of a match before a single point is played. And then there's the pure logistics of it all, the detail that keeps getting repeated because it simply doesn't compute. 2,000 people, 11,000 seats. The math doesn't work unless you understand what's actually happening, that this isn't a local phenomenon anymore. Fans are traveling, flying in from other states, other countries, organizing trips around a single third-round match the way people once only organized trips around finals. Eala's rise has apparently created a traveling fan base, one willing to cross state lines and time zones for the chance to watch her play live.
By the time the umpire calls for play to begin, the story has already achieved something rare in tennis. It has made a third-round match feel like appointment viewing for people who don't normally follow the sport at all. Casual fans tune in not necessarily to see brilliant tennis, but to witness the atmosphere itself, curious whether the hype matches the reality once the first ball is struck. That's the pressure both players carry onto the court. For Eala, the weight of living up to a moment is large. For Anisimova, the challenge of silencing a crowd that was never going to be hers to win.
Here's where honesty matters most in telling this story. As of right now, the match has not yet been played. Tonight's third-round meeting between Eala and Anisimova is scheduled, not finished, and any account of a shocking upset, a stunning fallout, or a viral post-match controversy would be fiction dressed up as fact. That's not a story worth telling, because it isn't true yet. What is true, and what already carries its own weight of fallout, is the conversation swirling around this match before it even begins. There's a very real tension building among tennis analysts about what a lopsided, heavily pro-Eala crowd means for the sport's competitive fairness. Some pundits have started raising a pointed question. Is it becoming harder for established stars to compete on American soil when a rising phenomenon like Eala pulls this level of crowd support? It's not a controversy involving either player directly. Neither Eala nor Anisimova has said anything remotely inflammatory about the other, but it is a controversy about the sport itself, about what happens when popularity outpaces rankings so dramatically that neutral territory stops existing. There's also a subtler kind of fallout happening inside Anisimova's own season narrative. Every match right now is being framed against the shadow of her spectacular 2025, 2 Grand Slam finals, a career that looked destined for the very top. Every loss in 2026 gets measured against that peak, every struggle picked apart by fans and media searching for the reason a former world number 3 hasn't been able to recapture that magic. Walking into a match against the tour's most popular rising star, in front of a crowd that already belongs to her opponent, adds one more layer of scrutiny to a season that's already under a magnifying glass. Regardless of tonight's outcome, that narrative pressure doesn't disappear. For Eala, the fallout risk cuts a different direction. When you carry this much collective hope into a match, a loss doesn't just sting, it becomes a headline. Fans who have organized trips, filled restaurants for watch parties, and turned a round of 32 match into a cultural event have also, whether fairly or not, raised the emotional stakes to a level where anything less than victory risks being framed as heartbreak on a national scale. That's an enormous amount of weight to place on a 21-year-old's shoulders, no matter how many top 10 wins she's collected this season. And this is really the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath tonight's spectacle. Incredible crowd support is a gift, but it's also a kind of pressure that most 24-year-olds, let alone 21-year-olds, rarely have to manage. Whichever way the scoreline falls tonight, both players walk into an environment shaped by forces well beyond their own game plans. Anisimova has to somehow quiet a stadium that was never rooting for her. Eala has to somehow carry an entire fan base's expectations without letting the weight slow her swing. That's the real fallout already in motion, hours before a single point has been contested. Not a scandal, not a meltdown, but the simple human difficulty of performing under a spotlight this enormous. So what actually happens when the lights go up and the first ball finally gets struck? That part of the story hasn't been written yet, and any script that pretends otherwise is selling you fiction as fact. But here's the truth we can build the resolution on, once that final point is played. This match was never really a coin flip decided purely by crowd noise. It comes down to 2 contrasting realities meeting head-on. On one side, a player riding one of the most statistically dominant runs against elite competition that women's tennis has seen from a rising stunner in years. 9 wins over top 10 opponents, 7 of them this season, momentum carrying her from a title in Washington through a strong run in Toronto and into Cincinnati with an 11-2 record across her last 13 matches. That is not hype. That is not just crowd noise translating into results. That is a genuinely elite hardcourt season, backed by a serve and movement game that, according to those who've studied it closely, thrives precisely in exactly this kind of high-pressure, high-intensity environment. On the other side, a former world number 3 whose talent has never been in question, a player capable on her best day of hitting through anyone on tour, as her 2 Grand Slam finals appearances proved just last year. The question hanging over Anisimova isn't ability, it's consistency, rhythm, the ability to find her explosive first-strike tennis on a night when almost everything around her, the crowd, the narrative, the pressure, is working against her. Whatever the scoreline ends up being, the resolution of this story was never really about who's more talented. It was about which player could better handle an environment neither of them fully controls. Eala has spent this entire season proving she can perform under pressure that would break most 21-year-olds, beating major champions in front of crowds that grow larger and louder every time she steps on court. Anisimova, for her part, has faced adversity before and clawed her way back from it, including a well-documented period stepping away from the sport entirely for her mental health, before returning to reach the top of the game again. Resilience isn't foreign to her story either. That's the real truth of tonight's match, whichever way it breaks.
This was never a story about an outsider crashing a party that wasn't hers. It's a story about two athletes from completely different starting points, both fighting to prove something about where they stand right now, not where their reputation says they should be, and not where a crowd's loyalty says they will end up. Tennis, at its core, doesn't care about ticket sales or flag-waving sections. It comes down to who executes better, point by point, when everything else falls away. And when the final point is finally struck tonight, that resolution will belong to the players, not the noise, not the numbers, not the narrative that built up around them for days beforehand.